Hi, everyone. I would like to welcome up the director producer of the film, Rachel Boynton, and our moderator, SCA alumna Maria Warith-Wade. Hi to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to turn off my video and hand it over to Maria to take over from here. But if anyone wants to ask a question, just go ahead and put it in the Q&A box. And then after Maria's had a chance to moderate for a bit, we'll take questions from the audience. So thank you all so much. And Rachel, thank you so much for joining us.
Can you hear me? Is the sound okay?
You sound great.
So do you. Great.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for introing this, Alex. Rachel, I just want to say thank you again for joining us today. And then also congrats on your theatrical release and streaming release of your film. I know it must have been a work in progress just because how documentaries work. And so just, a simple note and congrats on that front.
Thank you. That's really kind of you. I appreciate it.
Of course. So I just wanted to start by saying I'm actually from Richmond, Virginia. And so a lot of this film is very, very relatable in so many ways.
That statue at the end, the Kehinde Wiley statue, it's in Richmond now.
Yeah, no, I know. I've been to that statue quite a few times, actually. I think it's funny because, I grew up literally on a Civil War battleground, like my childhood house was. And then when I moved to college, I went to Boston. And so it's just really funny, the cultural shock in those two cities. But I guess one of the questions I have for you is how did you decide to explore, the Civil War narrative through the classroom perspectives? Because I think that even being a student myself, I realized very quickly that we saw just the foundations of America very different from states like Virginia to Massachusetts.
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you for having me here. The idea for this film started, or I got the idea in 2015, soon after the massacre in Charleston, South Carolina. I used to listen to a podcast. Actually, it was a radio show at the time. Now it's a podcast called The Diane Rehm Show, that's out of Washington, D.C. And she did a show that talked about how the Civil War was taught. And it was a very long radio piece. And in that radio piece, there was a reference to the Texas Board of Education and the standards of the Texas Board of Education in 2010. Most people probably, you're nodding like you know this, but a lot of people probably don't, that in 2010, Texas decided, this politically elected Board of Education decided that their educational standards were too liberal, basically. Mm-hmm. And so these people who were not historians went about rewriting the standards. It was sort of shocking. And when I heard about it in this radio show, I was so surprised at what I heard. First of all, I have Southern family, but I grew up in the North. Mm-hmm. So I did not grow up with this narrative in the classroom, the lost cause narrative per se. There were a lot of absences in my education, a lot of big blank holes, but the lost cause narrative wasn't there. So anyway, when I heard this, I thought it was sort of fascinating. And I went online and I actually spent the next 2 days watching Texas Board of Education meetings in order to find the one little bit, there were 2 bits actually, where they talked about this. And I was kind of blown away by the dialogue between this Republican and this Democrat grown women arguing about what the cause of the Civil War was, totally straight-faced. And I realized even back then, we were a very divided country. Today, things are in a lot of ways, I think, so much worse. But back then it was pretty bad. And I thought that looking at how this is taught could be a window into understanding the divisions of the country. It was really about trying to understand, sometimes if you're painting a portrait of something, if you examine a detail, through that little detail, you can get a deeper sense of the whole. And this seemed like a very important detail about how we understood who we were as a country, the story we were telling about ourselves, who we were, right? And that's where the idea began.
Got it. No, that's really interesting. I only knew about it because I'm a political science junkie. So
Okay.
I do actually read a lot of Washington Post and political podcasts. So yeah, I remember that happening. And I know McGraw-Hill is, I shouldn't have probably said the name, but I know they're a very big proponent of spreading different truths about American history. Just because we're talking about the classroom perspective, as a child, I actually kind of like your students that you were interviewing. I used to go to Jamestown all the time for field trips. Like that was something very common. And so I'm just curious, in going around the country, how do you kind of see historical tourism as either a tool or opportunity to kind of uncover truths about the Civil War?
Say that again. Historical
Tourism.
tourism.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, that's a really complicated question. Because of course the Civil War is, I didn't include this in the movie. I thought about including it in the movie. I couldn't. The wonderful thing about this movie versus my other films is that I didn't have to shoot anything. There are an infinite number of scenes that you could shoot for this movie, right? Like if one thing falls through, you can go and shoot something else. But one of the scenes that I had sort of in mind that I shot sort of, but I didn't shoot in a way that I was happy with, was, the Civil War is a major tourist draw. Yeah. And there are whole driving tours around the country where people go to visit Civil War battlefield sites. This has been a tradition for a very long time. And traditionally, it's white people who do this. I mean, it's mostly white people who go to Civil War battlefield sites and talk about the heroism of the story of the battles. And it is only recently, and you do have to kind of pat the National Park Service on the back, because they really are trying to address this narrative in the way the National Parks treats the story. And there's been a lot rewritten. There's been a real effort to include reconstruction and to address, the fact that the Black soldiers were not acknowledged. But traditionally, it has been a white tourism thing where people would drive around the country and talk about the heroism of the soldiers. And that was a perpetuation of this thing that happened during reunification when if anyone's read Race and Reunion, or if you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's an amazing book by that guy, David Blight, who's in the movie. That book had a real influence on me and my thinking, which is why he's very prominent in the film. But after the war, what happened was the white North and the white South decided to focus on the heroism of the soldiers, right? The white soldiers. And that there would be this coming together over the honor of the people who had died, the white people who had died. And it's interesting, I lived in New York during September 11th. I'm dating myself here. But I was very much an adult when the towers came down, and it was horrible. And it was interesting within 4 days of the towers coming down to see people gathering in the streets, with American flags, waving the American flags, talking about the heroism of the firefighters and the people who had died. And the tragedy that was that event was very quickly kind of not glossed over, but overshadowed by a focus on sort of patriotic, jingoistic, like, God bless America, let's go fight, nuke Saddam kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think those things are, that tendency to want to focus on the pride or the good feeling, or to feel like you've conquered in the face of mass tragedy, I think is probably human. I can't go to the September 11th site. I still cry every time I go there. So for me, that there are all these tourists who go down there and they look at the site and they take pictures, and I'll do a major circle around it because I can't take it. So I'm not really answering your question, except to say that I do think the tourism serves a function in a certain way because it allows you to distance yourself from the tragedy of the event, or to interpret it in some way. And I'm glad to see the National Park Service rewriting some of that history. But traditionally in our country, that Civil War tourism, I think, has been a tool really for ignoring enormous swaths of the story.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you bring up the national parks, because I was back home a few years ago, I guess right before the pandemic, and I actually met this guy who was a Black Civil War reenactor.
Yeah.
And I just remember being like, I said some different words to him, but I was just like, what are you doing? And it was just really interesting because once I actually, listened out and heard what he had to say, it makes so much sense. Like, no, you're not really taught about the Black soldiers there. And like, they were just as active and they weren't fighting for the same things. However, like they were a part of this story that, kind of gets completely thrown out of the window. And so through him, I've met actually quite a few reenactors who either go to Jamestown or they go to different, Civil War sites throughout Virginia. And it's really fascinating, takes a lot of, I guess, strength in different ways, because even in his experience, he has come up against people who were, kind of more my heritage, this, that, and the third.
Well, another one of the scenes that I filmed that didn't make the cut was I filmed with a bunch of Black Civil War reenactors in Massachusetts, because the Massachusetts 54th was a really important. Did you ever see Glory, the movie Glory?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, it's about the 54th, and it's about Robert Gould Shaw and the Black troop that he
Italian, yeah.
And that narrative, because it's a Massachusetts narrative, is very vibrant there for them, for this group of people. But those reenactors are all very old. I mean, they're people who are young. Yeah, really?
Yeah, no, I was very, he was
really
definitely,
interesting.
yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, he was in his late 20s, and I was like, oh, okay. But
That's
switching,
cool.
oh, go ahead.
I think it's kind of cool, actually. Like, I never meet young people, but this is like not a young people's thing.
It's
at
not.
all. It's just really not.
One of the questions I have, and this is kind of shifting gears a bit, but as we know through your timeline, a lot of this was filmed prior to 2020. And so
it was all filmed prior to 20. The film was ready to be released in January of 2020. I had a really hard time getting this film out into the world.
I kind of figured that only because of the Vimeo link that Alex so kindly let me watch the film on.
Well, that's a link that I've updated. I mean, I didn't rather, just so you know, I mean, I kept replacing the video. Like I had a link and then, but yes, maybe it's an accurate reflection. It's been done for a long time.
Yeah, I guess my question was more so around, because you were talking with young people, and young people were on the internet more in 2020 than God knows when. How do you think the interviews would have changed or shifted because of the year of protests and riots that, were quite visible? I even think of that young gentleman in Massachusetts who was just very much not getting what his teacher was, saying. And I'm just curious if you think anything would have altered their opinions.
That's a really hard question to answer because it's theoretical and I don't know the answer. I think the movie would have been a very different movie if I had been filming in 2020. I'm kind of glad I wasn't, because while I think that moment post George Floyd is really important, and I think where we are has shifted, I think it's super easy to slide. And I think the reality, the film is essentially a portrait of the country, right? I mean, it's going to all these different places. And it's a portrait of who we were in that moment when I was filming. And I don't personally believe that those fundamental aspects of who we are have radically changed between then and now. I think people might be a little more self-conscious about the issues and a little more self-aware maybe in terms of how they're coming off when they say things. But I mean, one of the pleasures of documentary filmmaking is always capturing something and showing it so that the people who are in it and the people who watch it can see it in a way that maybe it might not have been perceived in the moment, like that you can have a new point of view on things. So I think the time period in which it was filmed is actually kind of perfect because it reflects an aspect of our culture and who we are as a nation that I think remains very true. But I think the dialogue about it would be very different today.
Got it. And I guess in that conversation of just, how you thought of the film, how did you kind of gain trust with your interviewees, especially maybe views that you didn't agree with? Because I'm sure there were, maybe some, but yeah.
Do you mean like the sort of neo-Confederate type people?
Yeah.
I think in general, my theory, I don't know if you've seen my other films, but I tend to make films that are a lot harder access-wise than this one was. I generally believe that if you listen to people and you listen without judgment, and which is not to say that you don't have a point of view on what they're saying, that you agree with what they're saying, that you're not ready to argue with, of course, but that you give them space, whoever they are, to speak, they'll speak in general. I mean, who you are, like I'm a white woman, Northerner coming to these spaces, and that I sort of acknowledge that in the beginning of the film, just so people can see like, this is who's making the film. Yeah. It's not a movie about me, but certainly who I am changes how people respond to me. I'm a pretty darn good listener, I think. I am naturally, I naturally look for points of emotional connection with anybody I'm talking to. So with a sense of humility, like the notion that maybe there's something happening here that I don't understand. Like, what's the thing that's going on here that I don't get? And yeah. I don't go, even when I don't agree with someone's politics, or I don't go into a space with judgment of them as a human being. Mm-hmm. And I think that helps.
Got it. And I guess on that note, what were some of the most challenging parts that you faced making this documentary?
Releasing it was by far the most challenging part, and getting it financed. No one wanted to give me money. Those two things were really, 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 really hard with this film, like shockingly hard. I think I was maybe a little spoiled. I wasn't used to having, my other films got a lot of attention, and they were relatively easy. This one was just, whoa, this was hard. But I think in terms of the making of it, my other films are very narrative. Mm-hmm. They're both documentaries, but they're following stories that unfold over time. And with that kind of filmmaking, you are literally like, you just have to be in the room when something's happening, right? You have to get there. Mm-hmm. This film was actually a horrible idea from the very beginning. I knew it was a terrible idea for a movie. It's like, there's no movie. There's no there. Like, so to turn this into a film, to go around the country and to make decisions about what I was going to film next in response to what I had filmed just before, or what I had in the can at home, like building the movie so that it was actually a movie. Mm-hmm. That it functioned as a film when there is no character that you're following. There's no narrative arc that you can fall back on. This is structurally an incredibly challenging film to get right. So I'm really proud of the structure. This film is super well structured, if I do say so myself. I'm really proud of that. And I'm proud of my voice in it. I think I'm proud of the balance that I found. I don't generally, this is, like I said before, this is not a movie about me, but my voice was necessary in the film for a couple of reasons. One, like just to acknowledge like authorship and who I am and all of that, like who's telling the story. But also because in rough cut screenings, we found that the audience didn't have enough guidance. They couldn't follow what was going on. So finding a balance that felt right to me in terms of how to integrate my presence was a big challenge.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess thinking of students who are on here now, are there any tips that you can share about, I guess, financing a film that, is either tough to finance or tough in subject matter? Because I mean, even earlier, we just talked about the, I guess, narrowness of the Civil War and who's fans of watching Civil War content.
I don't know the answer to this. I think make rich friends, meet rich people who
That's real.
That's my first piece of advice. Rich people who like you, who want to give you money, that helps. That really helps, especially when you're young, because who has any money? And everyone, like, it's impossible when you're making your first film. It's not, I don't mean it to be discouraging. It's not like actually impossible, but it's really hard. You guys have access to stuff that I didn't really have access to when I started. Like when I started, there was no crowd financing. So that was not an option. I do think that that's a real option for people now. In terms of getting the seed money, you need to make something to showcase your talent. What was the other part of your question? Hard subject matter?
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say right now, I'm very frustrated with the state of documentary right now in our country because it's all very identity based. Mm-hmm. It just kind of infuriates me because my work has never been identity based. I'm really interested in national identity. My first film was about democracy. My second film was about international capitalism. This film was about like history and race. Like I'm super into like real big questions, you know? And there's a real trend in documentaries right now for people to make work that matches how they appear to other people. And I find that just really reductive and frustrating. It's like anybody, like a director's value is about how they see what they see in the world. And what they see in the world is related to who they are, but it can be big. Like any director is capable of making any film, in my opinion, if they approach it with their unique regard and an open mind. And, you know, I believe in directors. I really believe in directors' capacity to bring their self to their work and their like what they see, to figure out a way to make work that highlights their unique point of view, whatever that point of view is, right? And who am I to tell you what your point of view should be? And who are you to tell me what my point, like, you know, like, I think artists in this culture need to be given liberty to be. And right now it's tough out there because there's, especially like with grants and things, there's a tenant, like you have to check off these boxes about who are you? And then like the thing that you pick has to match what they think you are. And what happens if, you know, I want to make a movie, I don't know, about Chinese street cooks in Hong Kong or something, like all of a sudden I'm a neo-colonialist because that doesn't, it's just, I think that it's become very reductive in terms of allowing people to explore the world. Yeah. But maybe that makes me an old fuddy-duddy. I don't know. That's just my point of view.
I was going to say, as someone filling out I think it's the Common Core IDA documentary grant thing that's like 10 pages, I completely understand the frustration.
It's that, I mean, I could list you 20, but yeah. So it's you know, I'm a big believer in individual voice and in, you know, young people pushing themselves, right, to find that voice and to not take the limits that other people are putting on you and telling you like who you're supposed to be or what you're supposed to look at or how you're supposed to look at it. Only you know what's right for you. That's what makes you an artist. That's what makes you special. So I am deeply troubled by the trends in our industry because I think it's all being done in the name of something really good, which is to empower more people who haven't been given voice, which is fantastic and has to be done, right? It's just we shouldn't be telling people what they're allowed to talk about.
For sure. And then circling back to, this is my final question before we open it up. Circling back to a question I kind of quasi asked, but how was the process of just attaching heavyweight producers like Didi Gardner, Brad Pitt, Cameron Lewis Gates?
Well, Brad Pitt and Didi and Jeremy wasn't part of it, but Didi and Brad were executive producers on my last film.
Oh, awesome.
And so when I finished that film, Brad said in an interview, like at the Hollywood Reporter, we'll support whatever she does. And I took him seriously.
Knock
And
on that door.
okay. So, you know, I asked them to essentially lend their name to this project, and they said yes, which is incredibly generous.
Yeah.
Henry Louis Gates Jr. came on much later. It happens to be super tight with Sam Pollard, who's also an executive producer and who's a wonderful director. And I consider him a friend. And he was the very first person I called when I wanted to do this project. I said, Sam, is this a really stupid idea? And he said, no, Rachel, you can do it. And I was like, okay, maybe I can do it. So Gates came on because of Sam. So this business is all about who you know. It's just the truth. And finding your way in the door can be very hard. When you go to meet with people, I advise you to know their work. Watch people's work before you meet with them, and be humble, but like confident. You know, don't sell yourself short, but respect other people's work. There's like a certain attitude that I have a lot of young people who come to me to intern or whatever, and like the people who there's a certain kind of person who you're like, I really want to help that person, you know, like, but at the same time, access to the industry. When I started, the first film I worked on was shot in 16 millimeter. We weren't even working on video. So like the barriers to entry were so much higher. Like the technology that you had to know just to go through the door was much more difficult. And you guys, you can just take a camera, you can go out and make something. So there's enormous opportunity, but the money is tough, and you've got to figure out ways to kind of wheedle yourself in there and meet the people you need to meet to be able to highlight your work in the way you need to. Does that make sense?
No, I thought it makes sense. It was a great way to wrap up at least my portion of it. Alex, I don't know if you're jumping back on, but I just want to say thank you again, Rachel. This was really informative and useful for me, and I'm sure other students as well.
Well, thank you for doing this with me, Maria. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So I did something a little bit weird and had to hide my self-view because I was having a hard time hiding non-video participants earlier, which is a weird setting that for me not to have access to. So I don't really know. Are you able to see me right now?
I can see you.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right. So we have we definitely have a bunch of questions here, but I normally would just say, is there anything that pops out to you in here in the Q&A box that you want to answer first?
Let's just go through it from the top down. Is that okay?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the first one says, can you please clarify where the statue at the end of the film is? I somehow missed it. So the statue at the very end of the film, I shot in New York City. It was in New York at the end of 2019. It then got moved to Richmond, Virginia. So my understanding is that it's still in Richmond, Virginia, and you can go see it. So that's the answer to that one. I'm surprised that there's no reference to either President Obama, which feels like the second Reconstruction, and then President Trump, which feels like neo-Jim Crow. You must have considered this and wondered why you decided to avoid it. Good question. I did consider this, and I did very much decide to keep sort of present-day politics out of it, because I think in a certain way that can date a film. It depends on the film. With this particular subject matter, I unfortunately feel like this is a subject matter that we've been grappling with for a very long time as a country, and I think we're going to continue to really grapple with it for a very long time. And I didn't want to turn it into a film that is solely about the moment in which it was being made. Although I do think hopefully it's a film that will age well and will stand as a sort of a reflection of the moment in which it was made. But it was a very deliberate choice to not put the politics of the moment. The film is also covering enormous ground. I mean, there's, you know, history in it. It's traveling all over the country. There are like 100 different characters. There's just a lot going on. And so in the original pitch for the movie, I actually did say that I was going to include current politics. And then as I was cutting the film, we decided pretty quickly not to. So that was just the decision we made. All right, you do have a young Black reenactor. That's true. Marquette Milton. Who does J.R. Hardman know Marquette? Maybe I do have a young, that's true. He is a young Black reenactor, but he's also working at the museum. So it's a little different, which is to say, although maybe he reenacts outside the museum, I don't know. But in general, reenactors do not tend to be super young. Although I did meet some young reenactors, it does happen. I totally enjoy this. How do we get this link to show students in middle and high schools? I'm from Los Angeles, and I think this is a great film for students to watch and have courageous conversations. What grade levels do you feel would be able to grasp and have dialogue? Okay, I really like one of my big hopes for this movie is that it'll have a life educationally, because I think one of the things I've found in showing the film is that people come out of it like, I wish people could see it in a room together, because people come out talking to each other, like arguing about it. Like, I thought that was shit. What about that? Like they just, the dialogue after the movie, I think, is super productive and fruitful. And especially, frankly, white people watching the film, I'm hopeful that they'll come out of it thinking about their part in the racial conversation, not just the conversation, but the reality of our country and the role they have to play in making things better actively, not just like, as Kelly Carter Jackson would say, putting up a bumper sticker, right? Like, what is it that they can actually do? Where are they sending their children to school? Where are they going to church? Who, like, how are they walking through the world, and how can they change how they walk through the world to make our country a little bit more equal? But in terms of grade level, I think you could, the only thing in it that I think is questionable is the part with the Confederate flag, where people are using the N-word and waving the flag. That, I think can offend some people. But other than that, I think it's a pretty tame movie. I think you could watch it in middle school. I'm hopeful that I have an educational distributor that I've worked with on my other films. I'm hopeful that she'll work with me on this one too. In the meantime,
can I also add, sometimes documentaries get edited down to a high school version.
I have no money for that. I'm not doing that. But I will say that if anyone were to express interest in that, or to give me money for it, or this is a film that could also be broken down into pieces because it's episodic. I think it would be super easy to take, like, to break it down into themes, like dealing with the symbol of the Confederate flag. You could do a unit out of portions of this movie, or just reconstruction. You could just show that portion of film. So I think it can be very useful that way. I will tell you an open secret, which is that the film is already on Peacock. So you guys can watch it. You can go home and download Peacock and watch it again with commercials for free. And other people can do that too. But I am hopeful that I will, working with an educational distributor, develop lesson plans and actually have like an educational package that we can distribute, because I think this film could be super useful. I'd love to know how you financed and distributed this film. You mentioned having a really hard time getting it out there. The main money for this movie came from the Kellogg Foundation. And I was lucky. I was just really lucky. I think when you're going after money from foundations like that, very large foundations, I think it helps to have partners that are whose names are recognizable and whose track record is known, so that you're not, I'm sorry, there's a helicopter. I don't know if you can hear that.
You're good.
Okay, I'm gonna wait for it to go. But I think it helps. So for example, I was working with the Maysles Documentary Center, and I hope you all know who Albert Maysles is, but it's his documentary center. And I think the fact that they were the ones who were doing the application with me helped. It helps to have Albert Maysles' name on your application. So in terms of getting money, I do think figuring out partnerships that can help boost your credibility. Maybe it's asking an older filmmaker to executive produce for you or whatever. I think that can be helpful. Distribution, God bless my sales agents. I worked with a company called Synetic. I love them now. So yeah. Okay, you had Marquette Milton of the, oh wait, that one disappeared. Marquette Milton of the African American Civil War Museum in your film. He is a USCT reenactor. My question is, why didn't you bring greater focus on the election of 1876 compromise and how it launched the Jim Crow era and its political effects today? That's a totally legitimate question. There's a lot of history in this movie right now, and finding the right balance of what details to put in and what details to take out was a very heavy lift. It took a long time. I do think one of the great challenges of documentary filmmaking frequently has to do with information and what you include and what you exclude. And truly, there are a lot of things that are not in the film that I would have loved to include in the film. The whole process of making the film is very much a whittling down, like you start with this mass and then you whittle it down and you whittle it down. And a lot of things, I think your point is well taken. I think it's a very important moment in the country. And yeah, I agree with you. Okay, I'm working on a doc about women Civil War reenactors. Oh, cool. And I know Marquette through Facebook groups. I was so excited to see him. Hey, that's how people know. Great, he's cool. Okay, I'm from New Orleans, and there's a plantation museum in a nearby town that focuses on, yes, I visited that. That's the Whitney. Isn't it called the Whitney? Is it called, I'm pretty sure it's called the Whitney. Of enslaved people called the Whitney Plantation. There you go. I was surprised by this since many Civil War and antebellum preservation efforts focus on the perspectives of white people. Why do you think there's so few preservation efforts that relate the perspectives of enslaved people and their descendants? Well, the Whitney is a very particular story. That was this like wealthy white guy who sort of had an awakening, and he partnered with a guy who's from West Africa. I want to say he's from Senegal, but a West African historian, and they made this kind of amazing site that I scouted and ultimately chose not to shoot, but it's a beautiful alternative to the normal narrative that you get on a plantation. I think, you know, historical memory is the facts don't change, but the memories do. And so memory evolves over time. And what we're seeing right now post George Floyd is a real questioning of how we should be telling big parts of our story as a country, right? And I think the question about why do more plantations not include that in their narrative is because the public push, I mean, historians have been doing this for a long time, but the broad public push to challenge the narrative is fresh. It's happening now. And I would hope that more plantations do evolve and change how they tell this story. One of the things I also filmed that I didn't put in the movie, there's a lot that I filmed that I didn't put in the movie, was in Natchez, Mississippi. They have what they call a pilgrimage, and they do this like show that they put on every year. And it was traditionally an attraction for like Northern white people to come down and visit this town that had all these beautiful preserved homes and see people in big hoop skirts. It was a vacation for them, as Stephanie Rolfe would say. But that show that they put on, they've been trying to evolve it. They've been trying to rewrite it and incorporate new understandings of the history. My point is just, I think it is changing. People are trying to change it. Certainly in the era of Trump and the political divisions and social media, which really divides us. I think a lot of people, just like with mask wearing, for example, a lot of people hold on to things as almost like a political statement. It's not about facts, it's about feelings. And so I do think the danger with memory and how we tell our story is that it isn't really about truth a lot of the time. It's about what we want to feel. So I do think that's a movement in our country that's sort of counter to the progression. Okay, do you see the huge white and Asian turnout for the George Floyd protests as an inflection point in this conversation? I hope so. I hope so. I really do. I really hope so. I think certainly, I think one of the biggest things that's changing this conversation has to do with the way people in their 20s and younger, and maybe even in their 30s, but certainly like 20s and younger, how you guys are being educated. Like, you guys are learning stuff in school that people my age just didn't learn. And I think that over time, I think that makes a huge difference in terms of how people understand the country and themselves. And I hope it's an inflection point. I hope that it goes beyond just protesting and waving, signs. I'm a big believer that, people in their own lives have to ask themselves some hard questions about how they're perpetuating certain problems in our culture, whether it's just daily segregation or, like once you have school-age children, I have school-age children, so I think about this a lot, but like, where do you send them to school and how much money are you giving to the PTA and who are you, just thinking about how you support more equity in your neighborhood even.
So Rachel, that is the end of the audience questions. So I just wanted to thank you so much, and thank you, Maria, for joining us for such a fascinating conversation, for really helping us to continue processing so much of what's happening right now, particularly, around discussions with the Confederate statues that continue to populate a lot of our city streets. I know that this is something that I've seen in a lot of the cities around where I grew up, and so it's really something that we're living in real time. So it was really interesting to get to discuss it with you today, and I hope that people will continue to share this film and continue to talk about it in the classroom.
Thank you. I hope so too. That's really what I would hope. I hope that people will see it and talk to each other about it.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Maria. That was really awesome. You're awesome.
Oh, thank you. It was great talking with you.
Okay. All right, guys. Have a great night.
Take care.
Thank you.
All right, bye.